With the release of Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie, a lot of people are wondering what's fact and what's fiction. Today I'm going to clear the air by revealing the shocking truth about Napoleon Bonaparte and the historical inaccuracies in the new film, Blasting the Pyramids. What happened on that fateful day in July of 1798 when Napoleon's army arrived at the pyramids of Egypt, a place that must have seemed so strange to his soldiers? Before the French army fought the Battle of the Pyramids and won, Napoleon looked to the ancient monuments and addressed his soldiers. He said, 40 centuries look down upon you, and after this day 3 myths about Napoleon Bonaparte were born. The first myth is the most popular. It's the myth that's depicted in the new Napoleon film by director Ridley Scott. Napoleon lined up his cannons and blasted the Great Pyramid of Giza. The original rumor also claims that Napoleon was the one who destroyed the Great Sphinx by smashing off its nose. But I'm here to tell you that neither of those things happened. However, there are other strange rumors as well. One myth is that Napoleon entered the Great Pyramid of Giza and converted to Islam. He supposedly exited the pyramid and immediately said, "Glory to Allah." The rumor was alive and well in the first years after the Egyptian campaign. His conversion even appeared in the book Life of Bonaparte, first consul of France, from his birth to the Peace of Luneville in 1802. So 4 years later, there was confusion about what really happened on that campaign. There was also a myth that a mysterious phantom known as the Red Man appeared to Napoleon inside the pyramid. Napoleon supposedly entered the Great Monument alone. Then once inside, he either met a ghost or had some other profound experience. He exited the pyramid visibly changed and shaken, but Napoleon never told anybody about what happened to him while alone in the pyramid. However, none of these myths are true. Nobody who was with Napoleon in Egypt said that he entered any of the pyramids. His own private secretary said Napoleon spent 4 days examining the ruins of Memphis. But despite the rumors circulating that Bonaparte exited the pyramid and cried out, "Mahomet is the prophet," he never even entered it. His secretary wrote, "He never had any thought of entering it. I certainly should have accompanied him had he done so, for I never quitted his side a single moment in the desert." The very man who was with Napoleon the entire time claimed that he never entered the pyramid, and he definitely never shot it with a cannon. Instead, Napoleon ordered his scholars to enter the Great Pyramids and then report back to him with what they'd found. And what did they inform him, you may ask? That they found nothing at all because the pyramids were completely empty. And now for number 6. But first, it's shout-out time. I need to give a big thank you to Mark Well for the super thanks and for supporting this channel. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. The Battle of Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz was one of the most important victories for Napoleon Bonaparte. But for any of you who've seen the new Napoleon movie, it didn't quite go down the way the film shows. In the movie, Napoleon tricks his enemies onto a frozen lake and then shoots the lake so that it breaks, causing his foes to sink into their cold and watery deaths. It's a tactic that Ridley Scott didn't come up with himself. Historians and military experts have been debating whether this really happened or not for decades, though I will tell you now, there's no evidence that it happened. Here's what archaeological evidence says happened. The Battle of Austerlitz was waged on December 2nd, 1805. It was fought between Napoleon and the forces of Russia and Austria. It began with the French army seizing Vienna in November. The Austrians were waiting for the arrival of their Russian allies before going into combat with the French army. And that's when Napoleon decided that he was going to feign weakness. He sent his army north, making it look as if he were in pursuit of his enemies. But the north-moving army was really a trick. They doubled back but remained hidden, making it look as if Napoleon's army was in a pitiful state. Napoleon even abandoned the strategic position above Pratzen Heights to make it appear as if he were already giving up. He deployed the French army in a weaker position, urging the Russians and Austrians to launch a major assault. The Allies believed that the French would be obliterated easily. But then, just as the Russians and Austrians attacked, the French swept down from both directions and demolished everyone in their way. It was a surprise assault that earned Napoleon a place among the greatest military leaders of all time. It's considered a tactical masterpiece, and it's in the same league as the most brilliant military battles ever fought. This successful strategy even changed history. Austria immediately agreed to an armistice with the destruction of their army. So Austria was out of the war for good. The Habsburg dynasty was defeated and the Russian troops fled. And this led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. It was a brilliant strategy that changed the world, but it didn't involve a frozen lake. Meeting the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon Bonaparte's arch-nemesis was Sir Arthur Wellesley, who you might know as the Duke of Wellington. Although they never met each other face-to-face and they never corresponded, they were rivals to the bitter end. It was at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, that Napoleon was defeated. His permanent removal from the French throne and his fall from grace was assisted by Arthur Wellesley. These were two men who, in a different universe, may have been pretty good friends. They were the same age, both born in 1769, but they were on two different sides of the line. Arthur joined the British Army in 1787. He served in Denmark and India, rising to fame after the Peninsular War. He then led the Allies to victory against the French in Spain and served as the British ambassador to France in 1814. And of course, he fought against Napoleon at Waterloo. One of the rumors that appeared soon after the battle is this: when the fighting was happening, a British artillery officer came to the Duke of Wellington and said that he had a clear view of Napoleon. Guns were pointed directly at the French emperor, and if Arthur Wellesley gave the word, Napoleon could be blown to smithereens. In response, the Duke of Wellington said no. He wouldn't allow it because he said that commanders shouldn't be firing upon one another. Some military historians think Wellesley wanted Napoleon to survive the battle. If Napoleon had been killed in the field, people could say that maybe he would have won the war if he hadn't died. It was paramount to Arthur Wellesley that Napoleon survived to be defeated and disgraced. After the battle, Wellesley even refused to give Napoleon to the Prussians. The Prussians wanted to execute him, but Wellesley wouldn't allow it. In the new movie, Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington meet in person aboard the Bellerophon, but that never really happened. Marie Antoinette. One of the most blatantly false portrayals in the new Napoleon movie is that of Queen Marie Antoinette. In the new film, she's depicted as a fearless woman who meets her beheading with her chin held high. But in reality, she wasn't confident and she wasn't strong of will. She was troubled, scared, nervous, and didn't want to die. According to historian Dr. Estelle Perronc, Marie Antoinette was extremely sad and vulnerable. At the time, she'd recently been accused of an incestuous relationship with her son. She had tried to flee France but was captured and sentenced to die. Dr. Perronc says that based on the historical evidence, Marie Antoinette was nowhere near as feisty as she appeared in the film. Marie Antoinette was unlike how most people likely picture her today. She was born in Austria in 1755, and at the young age of just 14, she was married to Louis Auguste. Then, when Louis became the French king in 1774, she became queen alongside him. But it was the worst time in French history to be a monarch. Marie was widely disliked for her blatant disregard for commoners. People in France nicknamed her Madame Deficit for her nonchalant penchant for luxury fashion. And when the monarchy was overthrown, Marie's son was forced to testify against her. He was coerced into accusing his own mother of incest, resulting in great shame being thrust upon Marie Antoinette. Then in 1793, Marie was executed by guillotine. After so much trauma, she wasn't a proud, defiant, or fiery woman as she came before the executioner. There was another glaring error in the movie as well. Napoleon is shown watching as Marie Antoinette has her head lopped off. But in real history, he was 600 miles away when that happened. A terrible rider. In paintings and in the new Ridley Scott movie, Napoleon Bonaparte is shown as an excellent horseman, but in real life he was a terrible equestrian who could hardly ride a horse to save his life. One of the lesser-known symbols of the French Revolution was Napoleon's favorite horse, Marengo. He was a white stallion who was famous for his unfailing courage and ironclad toughness. The most famous depiction of the war horse is in the painting by Jacques-Louis David, which shows Napoleon clad in red and wearing his notorious tricorn hat. It's a gorgeous painting depicting a highly unrealistic element of Napoleon. One account described him as riding a horse like a butcher. Napoleon supposedly hunched forward over his mount, gripping his reins in one hand and pointing his toes down as if he were fearful that he would tumble backward. Despite his uselessness on a horse, though, he did ride, and when he fell off, he always got back on. Napoleon charged over any terrain, sometimes riding up to 50 miles daily. It's just that through all his campaigns, he never quite came to grips with how to properly ride a horse. You'd think a man with 80 horses in his personal stable wouldn't have that problem, but he did. His favorite horse of them all was Marengo, an Arabian stallion. Napoleon supposedly purchased a horse from a little kid in Egypt in 1799. Napoleon and Marengo remained together until the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon fled the battle battlefield hidden in a cart, leaving Marengo to be captured by the British. His horse was taken to England, where he lived out the rest of his days. In fact, Marengo was treated like royalty in Britain. He lived to be almost 40 years old. Marengo died in 1831, but to this day, his skeleton is still kept at the National Army Museum in London. Do you think horses should be used on the battlefield today? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Napoleon and Josephine. In the new movie about Napoleon, his relationship with a woman he called Josephine is at the center of the plot. The movie almost depicts Napoleon as a man who tried to conquer the world, specifically to win the love of Josephine. Then, when he couldn't capture her love, he destroyed the world in anger. But how much of that is true? What was the real relationship really like between the French emperor and his first wife? Well, for starters, her real name was Marie-Joseph Rose de Beauharnais. She was widowed during the French Revolution and was left single with 2 young children. Her husband faced the guillotine, resulting in Josephine's wealth evaporating. She was in her 30s and was considered at the time generally undesirable. Still, though, she made her way through Parisian society and cultivated friendships with politicians. Although she may not have been particularly desirable, there was one man who fell in love with her instantly. All the records show that Napoleon did indeed have an obsession with Josephine. From the first moment he saw her, he was intoxicated by the woman. They were married in March of 1796, when Napoleon was only a general, but almost immediately after, he was sent to lead the Revolutionary Army in Italy. There are still letters preserved that Napoleon wrote to Josephine while in Italy. Dozens of extremely passionate letters, bursting with emotion and declarations of love. Some might even say that the letters are more menacing than romantic. In one letter he says, "You never write to me. You don't care for your husband. I get no news from you, and I feel sure that you no longer love me." It seems that Napoleon may have been a little insecure. What started with love and admiration devolved and crumbled into a messy divorce. Both Josephine and Napoleon were having affairs. Also, Josephine never produced an heir for Napoleon, which was seen as a big problem. Napoleon's nephew had died at 4 years old in 1807, leaving nobody to take over the throne. So Napoleon started drawing up a list of princesses he could marry. Although they loved one another, Napoleon and Josephine were divorced in December 1809. The real Napoleon. The tagline for the new Napoleon movie is, "He came from nothing, he conquered everything." But in reality, that's a blatant lie. The truth is that Napoleon was born into minor nobility. He came from extreme wealth and most certainly didn't conquer everything. Here is the real Napoleon. He was born in Corsica to his parents, who were descendants of Tuscan nobility, on August 15th, 1769. Starting at the age of 9, Napoleon went to the finest French military colleges money could buy. He studied until 1785, graduating shortly after his father died from stomach cancer. Although he's now considered a military genius, Napoleon certainly wasn't in school. He graduated with a rank of 42 out of 58. Though to be fair, he did complete the course in half the time, because he wanted to hurry up and get into the French Navy. Some years went by, but in 1795, Napoleon had his first big success. He controlled a revolutionary outbreak in Toulon by turning his cannons on an angry crowd. The next year, he married Josephine and was sent to take command of the French army in Italy. But becoming emperor was an extremely complicated affair. Although Napoleon did have some success, he was also horribly defeated by the British at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon fled to Paris in 1799 and abandoned his French forces to continue fighting for 2 years. In Paris, he declared himself the first consul. Then in 1802, an amendment to the Constitution was made that allowed Napoleon to be the first consul for his entire life. 2 years later, he was voted emperor. His reign lasted 10 years, and during it he didn't capture as much as you might think. Napoleon did take a lot of territory, but he just couldn't contend with the British and Russian combo. In 1814, he was defeated and was sent into exile. He was banished to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. King Louis VIII was returned to power, and the days of French emperors were brought to an end. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5th, 1821. The very last word he spoke was the name of his estranged wife, Josephine, whispered with his dying breath. What are your thoughts about Napoleon Bonaparte? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Alexander the Awful. Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world and ruler of Macedonia, is considered the greatest military leader in history. He never lost a single battle. He defeated the Persians with ease, and his empire stretched across Greece, down through Egypt, and as far as India. He did all of this before the age of 30. Those are some pretty hefty accomplishments for a man in his 20s. There's no disputing Alexander's prowess as a military leader, but according to some historians, he was also one of the worst monsters in history. He's been described as murderous, raging alcoholic, and there's even a rumor that he participated in some unscrupulous activities with corpses. Alexander the Great assassinated his rivals, slaughtered people by the thousands, and massacred whole tribes of humans. It's even believed he arranged his father's murder so that he could take the throne for himself. Those aren't just allegations, they are historical facts. As soon as Alexander took the throne, he executed the princes of Lyncestis, along with every other rival who could possibly oppose him. He also immediately marched south and conquered Greece. Alexander the Great even murdered his best friend in 328 BC in a drunken outburst of fury. He may have been a brilliant and ruthless commander, but he also had a penchant for killing those closest to him. Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was voted in 2002 as one of the greatest Britons who ever lived. He was the Prime Minister during World War II, and he led Britain through their darkest hours while maintaining troop morale and ensuring Britain came out victorious over Nazi Germany. Many people view Winston Churchill as the only thing that stood between the Nazis and the destruction of the United Kingdom. Without the leadership of Winston Churchill, the Nazis very well may have crossed from France and into Britain, forever altering history. His political career lasted roughly 70 years, and so it's no surprise that he had his share of controversy. The biggest controversy these days is that Churchill was, despite being such a great leader, an unapologetic racist. In 1937, he was quoted as saying, "I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia." He went on to say that the only wrong done to the indigenous people was that a stronger and wiser race came along and put them in their place. John Charmley, the author of a book on Churchill and an expert on the deceased leader's life, says he believed in racial hierarchy. Churchill saw himself and the white people of Britain as at the top of the Darwinian chain, meaning the peak human race. This was hugely hypocritical considering England was fighting against the Nazis, who believed something very similar. Queen Hatshepsut's secret affair. Queen Hatshepsut ruled Egypt around the year 1473 BC. She wasn't originally allowed to ascend the throne, even though she had royal blood running through her veins. Ancient Egyptian law stated that a king's role could never be fulfilled by a mere woman. It was also said that the pharaoh needed a queen by his side, though a queen couldn't rule all by herself. Hatshepsut put this to the test when she ascended to the throne and claimed that she was married to the king of the gods, and for that reason she had every right to rule as any other pharaoh. She was a fierce and bold leader over 1500 years before the more famous Cleopatra took over Egypt. To secure her position and the respect of the people, Hatshepsut had to do the impossible. She wound up securing goods from faraway places that her predecessors had failed to acquire. She sent legions of ships across the sea to bring back ivory and gold and to establish diplomatic relationships with distant kingdoms. Hatshepsut ruled for 20 years and died around the age of 50, most likely from cancer, but she may have been hiding one major secret in her life. Near her tomb in the Valley of the Kings is also the tomb of Senenmut, a commoner. He was allegedly the secret lover of Hatshepsut, a man whom she was having an affair with for years. Yet he was nobody, a man who was forgotten by the masses as soon as he died. But he was buried in the greatest cemetery in Egypt. Archaeologists have even found graffiti left behind on the west bank of Thebes showing Hatshepsut and Senenmut together. Researchers believe their affair was common knowledge, but that the queen tried to hide her secret affection for the commoner as best she could, and although she may have been trying to hide it, she couldn't help herself but to have him buried near her own great tomb, so that they might meet again in the afterlife. The dark side of Martin Luther King Jr. There's no denying that Martin Luther King Jr. was an absolute hero. He was the civil rights advocate in the 1960s who fought valiantly against the oppression and discrimination that was so prevalent in America at the time. But while Martin Luther King Jr. was a respected and beloved hero in front of the cameras and while standing before crowds, his private life was significantly different. His career in activism started in the early 1950s when he boycotted public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. He was 26 years old at the time and already in possession of a PhD in systematic theology from Boston University. However, we know today that King's dissertation was blatantly plagiarized. He only got his PhD because he copied entire paragraphs from other sources and claimed them as his own. Normally, this is the kind of thing that gets a person's credentials completely revoked. But his dissertation wasn't the only thing that was plagiarized. When King delivered his sermon at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, large parts of it were plagiarized from a different sermon by a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick. Besides stealing his material, King was also a notorious womanizer who cheated on his wife, Coretta Scott. The couple got married in 1953, and throughout his travels, he saw a multitude of other women. In the summer of 1963, the FBI bugged King's phones and hotel rooms where he stayed while traveling. They thought they would pick up communication between him and the communists. Instead, they eavesdropped on intense, intimate encounters between Martin Luther King Jr. and a myriad of random women. The FBI even claimed they once caught King participating in a group affair of half a dozen people, including members of the church. Have you ever heard about these dark secrets of Martin Luther King Jr.? Tell me in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar is known as the Liberator of America. He was the brilliant Venezuelan military leader who successfully established Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Panama as independent from the Spanish Empire. This was a major deal in the early 19th century as Spain's hold over South America came to a crashing halt. Simon was behind the defeat of the Spanish in New Granada in 1819. He defeated the Spanish in Venezuela and Panama in 1821, Ecuador in 1822, kicked the Spanish out of Peru in 1824, and finally Bolivia in 1825. With the Spanish defeated, all these new nations were merged into the state of Gran Colombia, of course with Simon Bolivar as the president and overlord. But in the end, he couldn't hold the new state together, as separatists and federalists ripped each one apart. In 1830, he was removed forcibly from the government and nearly killed. There's no denying that Simon Bolivar played a critical role in liberating South America, but he still had his secrets and his faults. For example, he was married only once and very briefly while visiting Spain as a young man, but he quickly divorced his bride and then never remarried. Simon Bolivar was a notorious womanizer. He preferred to romance women he met while on the campaign trail, never wanting to settle down. Lastly, Simon Bolivar wanted to be a dictator. Sure, he liberated the countries of South America, but once he had done that, he tried to rule over them from a position of supreme power. This was what made him extremely unpopular and got him kicked out of office. The Secrets of Cleopatra. Cleopatra is one of history's most famous leaders. She was the very last pharaoh of Egypt before the rise of the Roman Empire and the death of ancient Egypt. And yet there are a lot of things people don't know about Cleopatra. For example, she wasn't even Egyptian. She could trace her family origin all the way back to Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I, making her more Macedonian than anything. She was also the product of a long history of pure bloodlines. In other words, she was a child of incest and went on to marry both of her adolescent brothers. But perhaps the most shocking secret of Cleopatra is that she may not have been as beautiful as history has led us to believe. Coins and other ancient relics with her depiction show a woman with a hooked nose and what could be considered manly features. Some historians believe she intentionally portrayed herself as masculine to come off as more powerful. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, Cleopatra's beauty was fairly ordinary, but it was her charm that made her so desirable. Hammurabi's Code. The Code of Hammurabi is the oldest complete code of laws ever written down. There were two slightly older codes of conduct created in the Middle East in the ancient Sumerian city of Ur in the 21st century BC. But the Code of Hammurabi was the first true code of law, complete and unabridged. It was proclaimed by the great Babylonian king Hammurabi, who ruled southern Mesopotamia from 1792 until 1750 BC. Hammurabi expanded his kingdom into parts of Assyria, Larsa, and Mari until he controlled pretty much all of Mesopotamia. He's considered one of the greatest rulers of ancient Babylonia and is mostly recognized today for his creation of the world's first great code of laws. But just how great was Hammurabi's code? First of all, the king never even tried to pass it off as his own code. He claimed to have received the rules from the Babylonian god of justice, Shamash. That way nothing could be his fault, since the laws were passed down to him by a higher power. By far one of the worst parts of Hammurabi's code is that it included gruesome forms of punishment for what were considered heinous crimes. It was all about the law of retribution, or an eye for an eye. The law stated that if a man broke the bone of one of his equals, his own bone would be broken as a punishment. And when it came to serious crimes, the punishment was usually a brutal death. If a son and mother were caught breeding, they would be burned alive. And if a pair of scheming lovers were caught conspiring to kill either of their spouses, both would be impaled on a sharp spike. Finally, if a son struck out at his own father, his hand was to be immediately cut off. Hammurabi may have been a great leader, but he also codified some pretty sick and terrible punishments. The disturbing truth of King Tut. King Tut's greatest achievement was reversing the radicalism of his father during his short life between 1341 and 1323 BC. His father had obliterated the traditional religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, and King Tut immediately reversed them. Much like Cleopatra, who ruled Egypt 1300 years later, King Tutankhamun was a byproduct of rampant inbreeding amongst the royal line. In 2010, researchers performed a DNA analysis on the remains of the young king and found that he was almost certainly the child of despised pharaoh Akhenaten and Akhenaten's sister. This was pretty standard in Egypt, since the royal family considered themselves descendants of the gods and needed to keep the bloodlines pure. But with a pure bloodline came congenital defects. King Tut himself had a cleft palate and a club foot. When the king's tomb was found, researchers were shocked to see that he was not buried alone. In the treasury room, aside from heaps of priceless treasures, researchers found 2 miniature coffins containing a pair of fetuses. Modern DNA tests revealed the fetuses to be Tutankhamun's children. It's believed that Tutankhamun impregnated his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, but after so much inbreeding, their children died before they could even make it into infancy. Constantine the Corrupter. Roman Emperor Constantine is seen as a saint. In the Greek Orthodox Church, he's considered equal to one of the apostles. He was one of the most pivotal ancient leaders in establishing the gospel and spreading Christianity during his rule between 306 and 337 AD. But while some see him as a saint, others see him as a corrupter of the church and a destroyer of history. Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity and the one responsible for stopping Christian persecution. But it's believed he had a serious ulterior motive for his conversion. At the time, Christians were becoming a majority in Rome. For him to continue wielding power, he needed to appease the Christians. He did this by unifying the seat of the emperor with the church itself. But by the end of Constantine's reign, something awful had happened. He had switched completely to Christianity, banished other religions from being practiced in Rome, and had started tearing down Roman temples. The gods of old were abolished. Rumor has it that those who refused to convert to Christianity were slaughtered, and the face of Europe was changed forever. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great rose to the Russian throne in July of 1762 and ruled as the longest-lasting female leader of Russia. And while she is remembered in the history books as being a brave queen at a time when men were the ones to oversee the world, the truth is that she stole her throne by seducing Peter III, the Tsar of Russia, and then usurping him at the first possible opportunity. Catherine worked hard to gain the support of the most powerful military regiment in Russia, plotting in secret to arrange the arrest of her husband, and once that happened, she immediately took over as the sole ruler. Peter was also killed at the hands of Alexei Orlov weeks later, assassinated by the brother of Catherine's lover, Gregory. Gregory was one of Catherine's many lovers, whom she had throughout her rule, and even before it. She had at least 2 affairs in the brief 6 months that she was married to the Tsar, before she had him arrested and stole his power. Which of history's great leaders do you think had the darkest side to them? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon for more great videos on ancient history.